Welcome to Implement This with Microsoft Business Solutions MVP Britta Rexted and co-host Matthew C. Anderson, where we have an insider's discussion around the things we consider when implementing Dynamics 365. In today's episode, sponsored by Dynamics 365 UG, Britta and I discuss date fields in the Common Data Service. The user group for Dynamics 365 and CRM, D365 UG and CRM UG, is powered by users for users and specializes in the delivery of member-driven education, networking, and events to help you maximize your current Microsoft Dynamics investment. We thank Dynamics 365 UG for their sponsorship, and now, on with the show. And now we're back with another episode of Implement This. Hi, Britta. How are you?
Good, Matt. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. We are making our way here further into the grand old year of 2019.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty good year so far.
Yeah, every time the calendar rolls over from one day to another, 1 month to another, 1 year to another, it's grand, you know?
It's the little things, you know? It's the little things in life. So.
And you know, for me, sometimes that also makes me think about the Common Data Service, model-driven applications, classic, Dynamics 365 customer engagement date fields. Doesn't that connection just immediately happen for you whenever we hit a new year?
Oh, yeah, for everyone. I'm sure that's exactly what they think of. Happy New Year! Yeah. Let's talk about date fields. Yeah, I know I did. I mean, this is the party I was at. That's definitely what we were talking about.
Well, what I will say is, less facetiously, I remember the first time I screwed something up with date fields when I was working within, it was Dynamics CRM 4.0 at the time. Mm-hmm. So I feel like we should probably talk a little bit about the date fields as they stand today, because it's come a ways since the days of 4.0. Kind of what some of the different options are that are available, how they can be used, some of the kind of war stories that we have that we can compare notes on with dates.
Mm-hmm. I think that sounds good.
All
yeah,
right.
No one should have to hold their breath and go, I don't know which one to pick. Eeny, miny, mo, that one. Yeah, so let's talk about it.
Yeah, don't forget about meanie.
Yeah, nope, don't forget about
that. No meanies for Britta.
No meanies. Nope. Okay. So, starting off with the options that we have user local, which that one's pretty obvious. That's the times it's going to represent the way that the user is in their own time zone. Yeah. So,
actually, before we jump into that, we should probably say, so you're creating a new field in Dynamics, and you're able to choose a date field, and this is going to be your default one that comes up. So if you take no other action, the type of field that you create, and the one you may have created without even really thinking about it before, is this one of user local.
Mm-hmm. And actually just creating date fields in general, because Power Platform would be the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yep.
So as we look at that, user local, so what do we actually mean by this, Britta?
So great example I have is when I first started playing with these, I had users in Minnesota and I had users in California. Mm-hmm. And so this means it's going to show up in their own time, which can get a little dicey sometimes. I think we're going to touch on that in reporting. But it's the sense that it makes sense intuitively in the time zone that you're in. Yeah.
Well, I think, this is probably where we should start by calling out the fact that when you're modeling out your data in the Common Data Service, one of the things that happens behind the scenes for you is that the platform is really storing a standardized, UTC date, and then based on this for this user local, it's applying a time zone differential for the person. So if you can consider the mechanics of what are actually happening here, when a user goes and puts a date and time into the field, or just a date into that field, that user logged in has a time zone that's associated with their user account. Mm-hmm. So based on them looking at that date, it gets stored in the database with this universal time that sits behind it that they don't actually see. They see the one that's relevant to their time zone. Mm-hmm. But when another user looks at that same record, but then has potentially a different time zone associated with their user account, they see the one that's relevant for them. And this is the same type of behavior if you have sent an appointment request in Outlook and you send it at 9 a.m. Central Time to that person in California who all of a sudden starts complaining because they open it up and it's 7 a.m. Pacific Time, their local time for that. Mm-hmm. So that type of experience, that type of behavior is what we see inside of any of these fields that are using that user local.
Mm-hmm. And if you've ever picked a date field and not thought about it, this is probably what you have.
Yeah, and the common things is like if you are scheduling appointments where it is going to be that specific time and you want it to be represented for it's happening at that place and at that time, that's where you want to have it, and that's how you're going to drive things like reminders that are going to be 15 minutes before that. You want it to be 15 minutes before each person's local time, rather than 15 minutes before 9 a.m. for me, and then 15 minutes before 9 a.m. for the person in Pacific time. It doesn't work very well. If
we won't be in the same meeting.
Have that calculation in place. So that's the first one. So within that user local, there are a couple of different options that you have for it.
And this one, I freaked some people out in mail merge when I used the date only, because we had date only. We were using date only for tracking, I think it was birthdays and anniversaries and things like that. Mm-hmm. And then it would print in mail merge with the time stamp, regardless. The fact that the field wasn't showing it, it would still print with that. And so it said that everyone was born at midnight, and it just looked dumb on the sheet. It wasn't a problem, but we don't track what time our clients were born. It's not relevant to the business. But internally, it was kind of upsetting. So it was funny seeing that it is actually still in there. And in some cases, it does come out. But also, you're not going to add a time field when it's not relevant to the business. And so most of the time, I think I'm doing a date only because time isn't usually needed.
Yeah, exactly. And therein brings part of the conversation of that idea of user local, because if you have a field, and let's use anniversary as an example there, if I store an anniversary in a date only field that is time zone aware or has that, and then that person on the West Coast goes and opens that same record, it looks like the anniversary is the day before.
Yeah.
And it's really not. Mm-hmm. And that's where, we'll talk in a bit here about some of the other field types that get around that problem. But, therein lies one of the first challenges that I ran into, and that, war story for me was around we were managing when we were going to have to build and manufacture products for customers that were going to have things shipped out. And I had kind of modeled that around, it was CRM4 at the time. We didn't have all the same kind of date capabilities that we had, so I just used what at the time was date only, user local, to be able to model that out. So for my team that was distributed across the U.S. and not all in the central time, they were not seeing the same list of deals that we had to go and do the manufacturing build for as I was looking at. So we got to that first kind of build meeting to talk about what was in and what was out, and there was all this confusion over why is this showing up and why is this not showing up? Why are all of these things showing up for the manufacturing build that weren't showing up in my personal pipeline view of this? Ooh. And what the cause of that was is a bunch of people were charged with some forecast cleansing of their own, and they had literally set a bunch of deals to the next day after the quarter was over, so they wouldn't be in the view for the current quarter. Which when I checked it as somebody in the central time zone, and a lot of the reps were central and east coast, I wasn't seeing those filtered in there. But when the counterparts on the West Coast were running that same report that had the time zone element baked into it, they were picking up all of these extra things that had been theoretically pushed out. And it took some, digging and figuring it out. And believe me, I learned that lesson very quickly.
You will never forget it.
Yeah, the first time that I did that. And it's, once you actually understand the mechanics that are sitting behind it, it's like, oh, you fool. But
that's not obvious.
Yeah.
Until you hit it and you get a panicked phone call.
Yeah.
Not obvious. That's why we're talking about it.
So we have user local and either date only or date and time for those. So I think that makes sense. I think we can.
And you just need to know that there actually is a time. It's whether or not it's just a UI element. Are you asking the user to give you a specific time, or are we going to assume it's midnight? Other than that, that there is a time, so we can't get away from that, which is a little annoying, but not too bad.
So let's talk about the next date behavior. So we had user local. Now we have date only. But date only is also one of the formats that we had on user local as an option. So I guess first thing to call out here is the names are definitely confusing within kind of how they're labeled here. But if you want to have that time zone not being applicable to what you're storing in there, you want the behavior of your date field to be date only, not just the format of that field to be date only.
Okay.
So that is as you consider your experience in doing that actual data modeling, you're creating that field. There are those kind of two different fields to be able to choose, or two different options to be able to choose from and set independently of one another. Make sure that you're picking the right one for the right type of experience that you have and how it's going to include the time zone.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So for the date only field, of course, the example of the pure date only behavior would be
like a birthday or an anniversary or something like that, where it just is. It's as simple as it could be. It just is.
And worth noting as far as how that actually gets stored in the database, because I know we had to double check this one before we recorded this. So the time does actually get stored along with that, even though it is the pure date-only behavior and date-only format. It still has 12 o'clock a.m. sitting physically in the database.
Yep, and sometimes you'll bump into it. That's not too bad.
Yeah. But, kind of differently, it's not being stored with any kind of, differential being applied to it. It's just the date, and that is going to be the time that is on there.
Because in that one, the time is irrelevant. It's only in things the time is truly irrelevant. What the date of death, the birth date, anniversary, something like that, where it's, really, really doesn't matter. Very clean.
Hey, birthdays and anniversaries matter a whole lot.
Oh, they definitely matter. They definitely matter. But the time zone and the time of day only matter so much.
Yeah.
So different though, because we're talking about making a time zone irrelevant there. Still different than the time zone independent field. So let's talk about the difference there, because there are times that you would even need a date and time, but you don't want time zones in the mix there. Yeah.
And this is a good one for being able to store things where the person, think of it like a customer service agent, may be looking at that record, and you don't want them to have to do some sort of awkward calculation on the fly as they're talking with a customer and talking about that. The example that I think is overused but applies so well to this is like a hotel check-in time. So if I call up Marriott and I'm confirming something and they're telling me what the hotel check-in time is, and they say 4 p.m., there's no question of like, well, what is that in my current time zone when I'm flying somewhere else? It's like it kind of doesn't matter. Independent, when you check in, it's going to be 4 p.m. for that hotel's time, and the time zone of the user looking at Marriott's business application in that case. It doesn't really matter because that person could be stationed anywhere around the world, and they're just conveying what that check-in time is. And if you've requested an earlier check-in time, it should be stored appropriately and not trying to calculate it based on, oh, but you're from Minnesota, Mr. Anderson, so when you said you were going to check in at 3 p.m., we recalculated that to be 4 p.m. Eastern time because you're traveling to New York. Like, well, no, I wanted it 3 p.m. for that hotel. So.
Yeah. Same thing with like event times if you're planning a conference or, when the play starts or kickoff or anything where, the time zone would be implied by the person who needs the information and, may or may not have anything to do with the life of the user. Who's relaying that information. Yeah.
So as we consider the many different ways that people can get to this information, this is an important place to call out some of the design or the user experience design differences between a Canvas app and a model app. Because for all of these different types of date and time fields, if you're building a model app, you have as part of the logical, kind of abstraction that's happening there for you, based on whatever type of date or date and time field you drag out onto your form that you're building or that view that you're building. It's looking at the logged in user and what their time zone is, and if appropriate, it's making any kind of a change in doing that offset for them. In something like a time zone independent or a date only, it knows how to handle those. For a date only, it doesn't even show the time fields or the time selection piece on there, and it just does that for you as a core aspect of kind of designing that experience using the model-driven app form designer. Now, on the other hand, if you use a Canvas app and you are going to build out something that connects to the Common Data Service or connects to Dynamics 365, and you want to bring one of these fields in, you need to consider what type of date fields you're working with, or you can cause some confusion with that. So, something to definitely keep in mind as you're building out those experiences, because there are some things that just happen kind of, automatically for you when you're building a model app that you don't always get inside of a Canvas app. Now, on the other hand, in a Canvas app, you can have, a different level of control of how you're showing things and how you want to build that experience, but it's on you as the maker as you're building that out. So, something to keep in mind as you're doing that. And one other area that comes to mind for me is, date fields are supported as something that you can do as a roll-up field. So if you want to get like the most recent, record date for a related set of related records, you can pull that up as part of a roll-up field and kind of display it on a parent record if you choose to. So there are some other kind of specialty uses and use cases for date fields where if you do that kind of thing, you have that kind of design capability and part of the power of the logic built into the Common Data Service that you can leverage for yourself there. That's something where you could do it from a model application. You could also do it with a formula in a Canvas app. So, again, just different ways to be able to solve the same problems depending on kind of what your background is, what you have permission to do inside of the system itself, and what you have to work with.
Something to keep in mind is you might run into uncalculated fields if you have, let's say you're trying to do some date math and your types don't match. I've run into problems before, especially when I'm using out-of-the-box fields, where I wanted to do some calculations on date fields and they weren't a match, so I couldn't.
Yeah.
So just something to keep in mind, especially from a design standpoint. If you're using out-of-the-box fields or using something that's already existing, take into account what types of date fields are already being used and go play with that in your test environment. Make sure you can do all the automation that you want to do, and you don't limit yourself there.
Yeah, and there's another one, considering kind of rounding out some of the other areas of the Power Platform, working with, data types such as, dates and doing date calculation and math and that type of thing within Flow. You do have some robust capability around that with some of the formulas that you can build in Flow, as well as using variables and changing data types that are available for you there. So you have some flexibility opened up with Flow as part of what you're doing there. And the same thing when you start looking at taking this information and representing it in Power BI, a lot of those same considerations are out there. Now you can pull in information like a user's time zone and do some of that offset and that type of thing as a part of kind of building out that visualization within Power BI. But again, all of these things kind of work together. So understanding what goes into the fields as you're modeling them out and what some of the downstream things that you're going to have to think about and work with, it's just helpful to be aware of that as you're building out that model.
Mm-hmm. Especially because once you save it, you're stuck with it. So you're going to have to replace that, which is a pain. We've all done it, but you don't want to have to go back and do that very often.
Yeah, and especially for some of these date fields, there are some obvious fits and obvious not fits, but there's a lot of gray area for some of them, especially until you run through a handful of use cases with them. So, kind of having that design consideration, especially when you're actually, adding new fields to the metadata model through the common data service, think about that before you just start willy-nilly adding them in there, or you can be kicking yourself later on.
Yeah. And a totally reasonable thing to throw out to the community and go on the user group or go on any of the community boards and say, this is what I'm attempting to do. I think this is probably the field type I want. Love some feedback. There's plenty of opinions on the internet to help you with that. Because someone might have thought of something or maybe even had that exact same scenario. And, their painful learning experience can save you some time.
Right on. Do you have any fun facts, Britta?
Yes.
Okay, I would like a fun fact.
Okay, fun fact. So I'm that person who likes to memorize what the limitations of things are. I actually had the Excel, I can't remember what version of Excel it was, but I had all the limitations for how many nested conditions you could have. And then when it changed, I actually appreciated the change. So I'm one of those weird people. But exciting, in case you want to go back and retroactively date things, you can go back as far as January 1st, 1753. That's as far back as you can go.
1753.
Which is actually a really big deal because I had a client who waited for that update because they had dates in the early 1800s that they could not save yet. They actually had a custom text field they had to put things in, and we were waiting for that update to hit so that they could have in date fields their accurate dates. So they do get used. Sometimes we're only forward thinking, but in case you have a fun use case for 1753, now you know January 1st is your date.
Yeah, so when you start building out your fun facts model application, if you're associating a date with when it was, you don't have any fun facts that date earlier than 1753, or you're going to be SOL.
I always want to know how they pick that. How do you pick 1753? Is clearly we won't need anything earlier than that.
Well, I'm sure if we were true developers, we would be able to understand and appreciate the reason why those dates would actually make sense.
Okay.
But,
well, I challenge any true developer to write into the show and tell us why it has to be 1753 because I'm just a maker and it doesn't make any sense to me. But I'm happy it goes back that far and my client was okay. So, yeah, but that's a fun fact. So I think that's a good note to end on.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks, Britta.
Thanks, Matt.
You've been listening to Implement This with Britta Rexted and Matthew C. Anderson. Do you have a business problem you'd like us to discuss on the show? Reach us through our website, implementthis.org, where you can also subscribe to the podcast. We're on Twitter, too. Britta is at MacGyverCRM, and I'm at MC Anderson. Thanks so much for listening.